All right. So let me introduce you to tonight's speaker. We are joined tonight by John M. Barr. He is the proprietor of Old Northwest Genealogy, an Indiana-based genealogy research company specializing in the 18th and 19th centuries with an emphasis on land and probate records. With expertise in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Minnesota, John can also navigate research throughout the U.S. He is an active member of the Association of Professional Genealogists and has served as president of the Indiana chapter of the APG. You can learn more about John at his website, oldnorthwestgenealogy.com. With that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you ever so much. Glad everybody got to join us tonight. Sounds like we got a pretty good group of people from around the country. All right, so tonight we are going to talk about using derivative history sources to find primary sources. Oftentimes, when we're doing our genealogy research, we get so wrapped up trying to find those primary sources, those birth records, those death records, the probate records, that we just overlook history books and other derivative history records. Now, what do I mean by a derivative history record? Well, derivative
on here, Lou.
is it means basically originating from, based on, or influenced by. The Department of Commerce says that derivative classification is the incorporating, paraphrasing, restating, or generating a new form information that has already been classified. Derivative classification can only be performed by a trained derivative classifier using existing properly marked classified source information. Now, by classified source information, they are referring to those marriage records, those birth certificates, et cetera, et cetera. That's what they're referring to there. To put it simply, a derivative record is any record that relies on other records for its information. These can be history books, record transcripts, abstracts, summaries, in some cases, even written family records. If your family's anything like mine, don't believe all the written family records. Now, as we go through this, another derivative that I want you to be aware of, census records and death certificates. Certain parts of those records are derivative depending on who the informant was. For example, if the enumerator came through during the census and the only person home was your 12-year-old son, he may not have known all the information. So some of the information in that census may not be 100% correct. Death certificates are the same way. If the person who informed to the doctors, if you will, if they didn't know who your parents were, that information may not have gotten put on there, or it may have gotten put on there incorrectly. So just beware of how you look at those records. Now, when we think of derivative records, the first thing we usually think of are history books, okay? Now, the American Historical Association says the history books are written as though they are a collection of informations. In fact, history is not a collection of facts about the past. History contains the making of arguments about what happened in the past on the basis of what people recorded in written documents, cultural artifacts, or oral traditions at the time that history book was written. Now, that brings about several points. But if you look, when you open up a history book, if you look at the foreword or the author's preface in that history book, oftentimes he will tell you how he wrote that history book. Just for example, this is 1881 A.A. Graham, History of Fairfield and Perry Counties, of Ohio. And he says in this, get rid of this if I can. I can't. Okay. He says in the preparation of Fairfield County, the various newspapers freely lent all the aid they possessed. Competent writers were sent to every township and every town, and thus every church, school, academy, and other public enterprise was faithfully recorded. Very many conflicting opinions arose among the older inhabitants, but these were carefully compared, and the one bearing the impressive truth preserved. The compiler desires to extend his thanks to all who aided him in any way in the preparation of the part pertaining to Fairfield County. Although the patronage from that county was not so large as from Perry County, yet no effort and no expense was spared to obtain a complete and reliable history. In this, he thinks he has been materially successful. The Perry County part of that book had been written previous and added to that book, but the author of that history says that the Perry County history is, with slight modifications, the same as contemplated by the author several years ago. Oftentimes in history books, and I recommend it, I'll probably say this again, that when you open a history book, I recommend that you read that history book cover to cover, time permitting. It will add overall a lot of context to your family history, context about what was going on at the time they lived, what the area was like that they lived in, how that area was settled, what was there prior to settlement, items like that. Now, you will find in a lot of history books biographical sketches. And these biographical sketches will add or can add so much to your family history, but they will also give you other places to look at. If we look at this biographical sketch out of Fairfield County, Ohio, it is referring to Emmanuel Bear. Okay, it says that he was a farmer. He was born in 1812 in Fairfield County. That he was the son of Joseph Bear, who immigrated to Ohio from Pennsylvania in 1800. So right off the bat, it's telling us where he immigrated from, who his father was, and that his father immigrated with his father. Okay, that they owned 400 acres. And if you read down through this, and you can kind of read it while I chit chat here. It talks about grandfather and grandmother Bear, where they were buried. States that the land was divided between three children. And it goes on down through here. It talks about it gives the grandmother's maiden name. It says that she got land or got money from in-laws back east, and that these were put into Section 28, where Joseph died. Now, if you look on down through this, you can get an idea of land, other family members. You get the idea of the land that he settled on as you look down through this, Wood County, Ohio in 1840. We go down through here, the Cowan Farm. That was in Perry County, actually. This came out of the Perry County section of that book. Talks about that he bought land from the Snyder Farm. It goes on down and says that, where was it here? Somewhere in here it talks about him having land in Indiana and Illinois also, which you wouldn't think to look there. But this is some of the information you can get out of these biographical sketches. Now, are there mistakes? Yes. What I've put in red there are different spellings of the Barr name. Okay. And this record I actually looked at first in 1994, and I used this record in several presentations. When I went through and looked at this record, or for this record in 1994, I looked in this history book. I ran through the index, and I didn't see any name spelled Barr. So I scratched the book, put it back on the shelf. I went to the next book. Years later, I ran across a fifth cousin through this side of the family, and she spelled her name Bare. Emmanuel was her great grandfather. As we went through and figured out the rest of the history, we found out that Joseph Bear, court documents have his name as Bear. His headstone has his name as Beare. Now, his grandmother and grandfather Barr here, all the court documents have that name spelled Barr. His original signature was spelled Bar with an ampersand, or however you say that, over the A. That's a German spelling, and a German translation of that is, in fact, Bear, not Bar. Now, another mistake that I highlighted here was the brother of his father. He lists as John Barr. It was, in fact, David Barr. But born in 1812, his uncle David, he died in 1824. So Emmanuel was young when he died. His grandmother, Shirk, she died way previous to 1818. And here where he has Mrs. Lance died prior to actually 1807. So there's people here that he didn't know or barely remembered. And you're going to run into that in all these biographies. And these biographies are scattered across history books. If we move into New Hampshire, we've got a couple of history books from New Hampshire, the history of Rockingham and Strafford County, with biographical sketches. We have Rockingham County with representative citizens. All of these contain biographical sketches that are extremely useful. You can take those biographical sketches and where they talk about those land transactions, you can go back and look those up in land records where they speak of other family members. You can go back into census records or birth records and find those birth records and get those primary sources that you need for things like genealogical societies. Excuse me. Where you have to have primary records to enter those societies. Now, these history books, like I said, they have biographical sketches of. This is out of the History of Rockingham and Strafford Counties book, and this is the list of biographical sketches that are in that history book. And I strongly urge you to look through your history books, find history books for the area that you're doing research in, and go through those biographical sketches. Now, that kind of covers history books, but let's move on to abstracts. And abstracts, they can cover a realm of possibilities, okay? They contain the most important details of a specific document. Now, abstracts can be found in court minute books, probate and court or birth indexes. They can be historical abstracts or summaries like those found in history books. A good example of that is the Barber collection out of Connecticut. Now, we'll go through these. If you dig into your court minute books in the county courthouse where you're researching, a lot of those are online, and you can find a lot of those. Most of them are indexed either in the front or in the back, or they may even contain a separate index. But you can go through there. They're going to be handwritten, fair warning, and they're not going to be real easy to read. This is a minute book out of Ohio, out of Fairfield County. And this one I highlighted says that Joseph Barr came into court and acknowledged to owe the state of Ohio the sum of $500 to be levied of his goods and chattels, lands, and tenements for use of the state aforesaid, if he fail to be of peace and good behavior toward the good people of the state of Ohio, and more particularly towards Martin Kaufman and his family. Now, what do we take out of that? And what can we look for out of that? There is more to that story. Okay, that is just a brief summary of that court case. In this particular entry, I was able to go back to the clerk of courts, and they were able to go back and pull the common pleas packet for this case. And there was a ton of information in there. Back in that biography that we looked at of Emmanuel Barr, it said that his father broke up after the War of 1812. His father did more than just break up after the War of 1812. His father got excessively violent. What was not in that record was the fact that in 1827, when he moved the family to Perry County, his wife divorced him because he beat her. So Joseph Barr was not a kind gentleman after the War of 1812. But having said that, you can use that and go back and look in records of the War of 1812. Okay, you can use this record here. Like I said, I went back to the county court and they pulled this record. The entire lawsuit against Martin Kaufman and several of his family members. And you can piece together some of the things that were going on at the time, how people acted, who the neighbors were. Now, I mentioned probate and birth indexes. If you look into these indexes, excuse me, you can find a ton of information. The area that I've got highlighted in blue are the dates that these probates were filed. The next column is the name that the probate was under. The highlighted red column is the most important column of this index. It is the case number. With this case number, you can go to your probate court or your clerk of courts, whoever handles probate for the area that you're researching in. And you can give them this case number and they can pull the packet for that probate. The things you will find in that packet will blow you away. It will contain inventories of the estate. It will contain sales for the inventory if there was estate inventory. It will contain, obviously, family members. It may contain the original will, if there was one. It will contain original receipts for debts paid out of that estate or paid to that estate. There have been cases where I've gotten in these probate packets and found land records that were never recorded with the state recorder or with the county recorder. So the amount of information you can pull out of those packets is just unmeasurable. If you go on across, if that will was recorded in a will book, it gives you here the book and page number where you can find that person's will. Birth indexes carry some of the same information. They will list a certificate number. They will list the parents' names, date of birth, etc. Now, if we go on, I mentioned the Barber collection for summaries. That Barber collection is 55 volumes of pre-1870 vital records for the entire state of Connecticut. And I would imagine that doing research in your area, you will run across cases out of Connecticut. This record set gives, like all summaries should give, the volume and page number of where these records are found. And this copy that I put up here, or this photo that I put up here, the first few are marriages, okay? It says married, John of Ridgeford married Ebenezer, and I'm not going to try to pronounce her name, as in Ebenezer Benedict. The last couple are births. Nancy, rather, daughter of Amos, born July 9th, 1810. Silas, son of Amos, born March 1st of 1822. Birth volume 2, page 100. So it gives you where to look for those records. And so many times in these records, you will find that information. If you don't find that information, you'll at least have an idea of where to look. If it doesn't give you a specific volume or page number, you know that you need to go to probate records, or you need to go to land records to find your primary sources. Now, summaries, be it a full written summary or a family paper, summaries are simply a conclusion based on research of primary documentation. The best example that I've found for summaries are in the Mayflower Silver Books. These silver books are every family that was on the Mayflower through the 5th generation of that family. And if you look into them, and I'm sorry, these are bad copies, you've got, of this family, you've got the 1st generation, and you've got the 2nd generation, and the 3rd generation. They give you a brief summary of that person, and then a listing of all of the family members, when and where they were born. From this, you can go to that county archive or that state archive, and you have a better idea of what you're looking for, or where to find those primary records. And again, with the Mayflower, like any other society, you have to have those primary records. Okay, these derivative records are not usable because they are made from other records and they contain mistakes. Now, the worst case scenario in this is you find your ancestors' fan club. And when I say fan club, okay, you've probably heard that term before. It's the friends, acquaintances, and neighbors. And it gives you a base of other people to look at. And I've used these. I've had to write proof arguments based on that fan club to prove either a marriage or a birth. I ended up in one. I went through land records for a probate that was found in Virginia. The entire family and everybody in that will, family and friends that were mentioned in that will and that probate record, were living in North Carolina. And I was able to prove through those records, through that fan club, that there had been intermarriages, that they all lived within 10 miles of each other, and that there was no doubt of who that family was. Now, I mentioned they can make mistakes, and they do. Excuse me. In the History of New Hampshire by Jeremy Belknap, written in 1813, it says in his foreword that when the first volume was printed, I had not seen the political annals of the American colonies published in 1780 by George Chambers, Esquire. This gentleman, being in England, was favored with some advantages of which I was destitute. Having access to the books and papers of the lords of trade and plantations from the first establishment of that board, he seems to possess the diligence and patience which are necessary in a historian, but either through inadvertence or want of candor, he made some misrepresentations respecting New Hampshire, on which I shall take the liberty to remark. And most history books will contain something similar to that in the foreword. If they don't, they should. Because if we go back and think back to what I first said, history books are written based on what the author or the compiler was told at the time that he wrote the book. And there may be a lot of conflicting stories.
That power reserved for the legislature. I would love to have it.
There may be a lot of conflicting stories. Now, to go with that statement, those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a movie that came out in 1962. That movie was called Geronimo. It had Chuck Connors and Adam West in it. And yes, I'm showing my age. But the prologue to that movie on the big screen said that history has created heroes out of legend and out of fact. This story combines both legend and fact in telling of such heroes, of their striving for freedom and dignity against impossible odds. That, in and of itself, pretty well summarizes every derivative record that you will ever run across. The story combines legend and fact. So you're going to read a history book, and there's going to be a lot of stuff that you may have heard in school that may be just plain legend that can't be proven, can't be disproven. It's also going to contain a lot of fact. Now, in the handout that hopefully everybody was able to get a copy of, I mentioned a lot of links that can help you finding these derivative records. Heavy Trust, the Internet Archive, and I'll go down through these. We'll take a look at just about each one of them. We will start with Heavy Trust. Heavy Trust is an internet site. You can type in a search, okay? Full text or all fields you can search, and I typed in here that history book of the history of New Hampshire, and it will give you every title that it has in that archive that relates to the history of New Hampshire. Now, the thing I like about Heavy Trust is you can go through it and you can search the text. I pulled up Peter Kaufman, and we've got 14 results for Peter Kaufman in this history book. So you can search the name of your ancestor in that history book online and see if he's in there. Now, bear in mind that spelling may be different, so you may have to search it by every known spelling, but it's worthwhile. The Internet Archive is another one that I use frequently. You can do a search in the Internet Archive, and here again, I search for the history of New Hampshire, and you will get anything that has to do with the history of New Hampshire. You see, I got 4,097 results here. I got the book that I'm speaking of. I got the Birds of New Hampshire, and I got the history of the Diocese of New Hampshire. So you'll get a lot of different, but as you go through there, you'll find what you're looking for. And again, in the Internet Archive, that text is searchable. So I searched for Peter Kaufman, and we ended up with 32 results. Now, in the other book, we only ended up with 14, but the Internet Archive, I put in Peter Kaufman. So it's showing me anything that comes up under Peter, anything that comes up under Kaufman, or anything that comes up with the two of them together. If you put quotation marks around Peter Kaufman, it will only search for that specific term. So just kind of a hint there. I mentioned the Library of Congress. The history book that I use for the most of this, the history of New Hampshire, I got what I got out of that history book, I got through the Library of Congress, although it is mentioned in these other sites. And you can search anything you want. Many times you can get full text results out of the Library of Congress. Another book I use, or another site that I use frequently, is WorldCat. WorldCat is a catalog of that almost every library in the country submits their indexes to. And when I go into WorldCat and I search the history of New Hampshire by Jeremy Belknap, I come up with 12 editions of that book in 454 libraries near Indianapolis. It will tell you what, and it will give you a summary of what libraries are close to you, who has the book that you're looking for, so you can actually go look at the hard copy if you choose. Sometimes that's easier than pulling it up on the internet. So hopefully in the last 50 minutes, I haven't bored you to death. And I've given you some insight on what you can pull out of derivative records and how you can use that information in your own research. I would implore all of you to use history books. Don't forget about them. And I will leave you with this thought from that Fairfield and Perry County history book. But as long as human minds are forgetful, so long will history contain errors. So, I'm sure there's going to be a million questions. So feel free.
Thank you, John. That was great. And for folks who are here, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves. And you can ask questions out loud. You can use the hand raising feature if you like, or you can type any questions into the chat.
That Katie will read to me because I can't see the chat.
Anyone? Any questions? I think you may have covered it all, John.
Something.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
What happens when you have two sources, derivative sources that conflict with each other?
That happens more often than you may think. But if you think back to that beginning slide where A.A. Graham said in his preface that there were conflicting memories, and you're going to have that. You're going to have conflicting memories. And I can go back through several history books from Fairfield County and find exactly what you're talking about. If it is a family history, those conflicting memories are going to be just like what you find on Family Search or Ancestry.com today. People are not going to agree on who was who. You're just about going to have to go back and find primary sources. You can always do it. Go back and find primary sources, differentiate, figure out which one's right. A lot of times you're going to run into people with the same names in the same county. I did exactly that in my family history, and I went down a path for the better part of a week, only to find out I was on the wrong family. So it happens to everybody, and it does show up quite often in history books. It's time consuming to figure it out, but go through those biographical sketches where you find that, or whatever part of the history book you're in. There will be some information as to where that information came from. I like to say that yes, they're derivative sources, but the information within those derivative sources came from a primary source somewhere. It's just up to us as the researcher or the genealogist to find it.
We have a question. The question is, I missed where to find the Mayflower books.
Okay, the Mayflower books, and you didn't miss it, I just forgot to say it. The silver books are not available online. But actually, if you just Google Mayflower silver books, it will tell you where they're at, or you can go to any of those sites that I talked about at the end, and it will give you a catalog. Go to WorldCat and type in Mayflower silver books, and it will tell you what library closest to you has copies. There are, I'm not going to lie, I don't know. There's tons of volumes of those. I know when I go to our state library here and I go through them, they have like 2 bookshelves that are nothing but silver books. There's 50 or 60 volumes, I'm going to guess. But you're only going to be able to look at hardbound copies of those.
We do have a set here at the library of I don't believe it's a complete set, but we have actually kind of a random smattering. We have volumes 1, 2, 3, 10, 11, 12, 18. So yes, and Tylene has said in the chat that UNH has them at the Diamond Library. And for anyone in New Hampshire, Diamond Library at UNH, New Hampshire residents are eligible for a free library card there. So you're always welcome to go in and get a card. At UNH now is a great time to go because there's parking available. But you can always use the university libraries. They're a great resource. Any other questions for John? Well, oh, Gail says thank you.
You are more than welcome. Thank you for having me, all of you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, John. This was great. I think this was a great overview of derivative resources, and yeah, good reminders. Lots of good information. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone for coming and spending your Thursday evening with us. We appreciate all of you, and especially we want to thank the DAR, the Ranger chapter of the DAR, who are our co-sponsors for the genealogy workshops. I forgot to say that at the top. Well, everyone, have a great night. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Have a great night.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming.